The moon hung like a chipped tooth in the inky sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown cemetery. Thomas shuffled through the uneven ground, his breath misting in the cold night air. He clutched a rusty crowbar, its cold metal a stark contrast to the burning resentment simmering in his gut. He hadn't planned this, not exactly. It had started as a simmering anger, a low hum of discontent that had grown into a roaring inferno over the past few weeks. Pastor James's death, the outpouring of grief, the endless eulogies praising the man's supposed goodness. It all felt like a personal affront. Pastor James. The name itself grated on Thomas's nerves. He'd lived in this town his whole life, and while he'd never actively disliked the pastor, he'd always held him at arm's length. James was everything Thomas wasn't. Charismatic, well-liked, a pillar of the community. And, of course, black. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? A subtle, unspoken resentment that had festered in the dark corners of Thomas's heart for years. He'd always felt a simmering unease about the pastor's prominence, a feeling he couldn't quite articulate, but which manifested as a quiet, persistent dislike. The pastor's funeral had been a spectacle, a testament to the man's influence. The church overflowed with mourners, their tears a testament to James's supposed kindness. Thomas had watched from the periphery, a bitter observer, his heart filled with a sour cocktail of envy and resentment. He'd seen the genuine grief etched on the faces of those who'd known the pastor, and it only fueled his anger. It felt unfair, this outpouring of love for a man who, in Thomas's eyes, hadn't deserved it. He found the grave easily enough. A simple headstone, almost swallowed by the encroaching weeds, bore the pastor's name, James Elijah Walker. The inscription below spoke of a life dedicated to service, a legacy of faith and compassion. Thomas scoffed, the words ringing hollow in his ears. Service? Compassion? He'd seen nothing but hypocrisy. He'd seen the pastor's preferential treatment of those within his own community, the subtle slights directed towards those who didn't fit the mold. Or so he believed. He knelt, the cold earth seeping into his worn jeans. He felt a flicker of hesitation, a tiny spark of doubt that threatened to extinguish the fire of his rage. But it was quickly snuffed out by the bitter resentment that had consumed him for weeks. He gripped the crowbar tighter, his knuckles white against the rusty metal. With a grunt, he began to pry at the headstone. The old stone resisted at first, groaning under the pressure, but eventually, with a sickening crack, it gave way. He pulled it aside, revealing the earth beneath. He didn't stop there. He used the crowbar to further desecrate the grave, tearing at the earth, scattering the soil, a chaotic dance of destruction fueled by his anger. He felt a strange satisfaction, a perverse sense of power in defiling something he so deeply despised. He tossed the crowbar aside, the metal clanging against the stone, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. He stood there, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the disturbed earth, the remnants of his destructive act, a stark testament to his hateful deed. But even as a twisted sense of satisfaction washed over him, a seed of unease began to sprout in his heart. It was a small seed, barely perceptible, but it was there, a tiny crack in the wall of his resentment. He turned and walked away, leaving the desecrated grave behind, unaware of the turmoil that awaited him. The night was far from over. The walk home was longer than usual. The familiar streets seemed to stretch out before Thomas, each step heavy with a newfound weight. The night air, once a comforting chill, now felt thick and suffocating, clinging to him like a shroud. He tried to shake off the feeling, to dismiss it as the lingering effects of the cold, or perhaps the late hour. But the unease gnawed at him, a persistent discomfort that refused to be ignored. It wasn't the physical exertion of his act of vandalism that weighed him down. It was something far more insidious, a creeping sense of guilt that snaked its way into his thoughts, whispering doubts and unsettling questions. He'd expected a surge of triumph, a feeling of vindication, but instead he was left with a hollow ache, a void where satisfaction should have been. The act itself had been easy, almost mechanical, fueled by years of pent-up resentment. But the aftermath was a different beast entirely. He tried to rationalize his actions. He told himself he'd only done what he felt was right, that Pastor James hadn't deserved the reverence he'd received. He replayed the events of the night in his mind, focusing on the perceived injustices, the slights, the imagined hypocrisy. He clung to these justifications, desperately trying to convince himself that he'd acted justly. But the rationalizations felt flimsy, like cobwebs easily brushed aside by the wind. The images of the desecrated grave, the scattered earth, the broken headstone, kept flashing before his eyes, refusing to be erased. He felt a strange disconnect, a chasm between the anger that had driven him and the unsettling emptiness that now filled him. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name, a disquiet that burrowed deep into his soul. He reached his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the silence amplifying the turmoil within him. He switched on the lights, the harsh glare doing little to dispel the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of the room. He sat heavily on the worn couch, his gaze fixed on the flickering television screen, but his mind was far away, replaying the events of the night, each detail etched into his memory. He tried to distract himself, flipping through channels, but nothing held his attention. The news, usually a source of cynical amusement, felt irrelevant, distant. He tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes, blurring into meaningless shapes. He even attempted to drink, hoping the alcohol would numb the growing unease. But the liquor only served to amplify the unsettling feelings, turning them into a churning vortex of anxiety. Sleep evaded him. He tossed and turned, the sheets twisted around his legs, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a deeper, more unsettling feeling, a sense of profound unease, a premonition of something far more significant than a simple act of vandalism. He knew, deep down, that he had done something wrong, something he couldn't simply erase or ignore. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a heavy burden he couldn't escape. He closed his eyes, hoping for sleep, but instead he found himself staring into the darkness, the unsettling premonition growing stronger with each passing moment. The night was far from over. Sleep finally came, but it wasn't the restful slumber Thomas craved. Instead, he was plunged into a world of vivid, unsettling dreams. He found himself standing in a small, dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else, something he couldn't quite place, a faint sweetness tinged with sorrow. The room was sparsely furnished, a worn wooden table in the center, a few chairs pushed against the walls. The only light came from a single oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. In the center of the room sat a young man, his face etched with a weariness that belied his youthful appearance. He was younger than Thomas remembered Pastor James ever being, his features softer, less etched with the lines of time and hardship. But there was no mistaking the kind eyes, the gentle smile that played on his lips as he spoke softly to a woman who sat across from him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A young child clung to her side, his small hand gripping her dress, his face buried in her shoulder. Thomas watched, a silent observer in this strange, dreamlike world, as the young man, Pastor James, offered words of comfort, his voice a soothing balm to the woman's grief. He spoke of faith, of hope, of the enduring power of love. His words were simple, yet they resonated with a depth that transcended their simplicity. He didn't preach or lecture. He listened, offering empathy and understanding. He held the woman's hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. The scene shifted, revealing glimpses of other interactions. The young Pastor James tending to a sick child, his touch gentle and caring. He was seen sharing food with a group of impoverished families, his smile radiating warmth and compassion. He was shown advocating for the rights of the marginalized, his voice ringing with conviction and strength. Each scene was a snapshot of a life dedicated to service, a testament to a spirit filled with unwavering faith and boundless compassion. The dreams were not simply visual. They were sensory experiences. Thomas felt the chill of the night air, the rough texture of the wooden table, the warmth of the oil lamp's glow. He smelled the wood smoke, the faint scent of herbs, the subtle aroma of freshly baked bread. He even felt the weight of the woman's grief, the child's fear, the young pastor's unwavering determination. It was as if he were not merely observing these events. He was experiencing them, living them, feeling them in his very soul. The dream continued, unfolding like a tapestry woven from threads of compassion, faith, and unwavering dedication. It wasn't a romanticized portrayal of a saintly figure. It was a raw, honest depiction of a life lived in service to others, a life filled with challenges, struggles, and moments of profound joy. And yet, underlying it all was a consistent theme: the unwavering faith of a young man who dedicated his life to helping those in need, regardless of their background or circumstances. As the dream progressed, Thomas began to feel a growing sense of unease, a disquiet that went beyond the simple discomfort of his guilt. He felt a strange connection to this young pastor, a sense of empathy he hadn't expected. The images, the emotions, the experiences, they were all seeping into his consciousness, stirring something deep within him, something he had long suppressed. The dream ended abruptly, leaving Thomas awake, his heart pounding, his mind reeling from the intensity of the experience. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning. The following nights brought more dreams, each one a vivid tapestry woven from threads of Pastor James's life. They weren't chronological. Instead, they jumped across decades, offering glimpses into different periods of his ministry. One moment, Thomas found himself in a bustling soup kitchen, the air thick with the aroma of simmering stew and the murmur of conversations. Pastor James, older now, his hair streaked with gray, moved effortlessly through the crowd, his smile a beacon of warmth amidst the throng of hungry people. He served food with quiet dignity, his touch gentle, his eyes meeting each person's with genuine compassion. Thomas felt the warmth of the room, the comforting aroma of the food, the weight of the hunger in the room. He even felt the rough texture of the wooden serving spoon in his hand as he helped serve the food. Another dream transported him to a hospital bedside, where Pastor James sat vigil beside a sick child, his hand resting gently on the small, feverish brow. The room was hushed, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Thomas felt the weight of the child's illness, the parent's fear, the pastor's unwavering faith. He saw the quiet strength in the pastor's posture, the gentle reassurance in his eyes. He felt the cool touch of the child's forehead and the weight of the parent's worry. Yet another dream showed Pastor James leading a protest march, his voice ringing out above the din of the crowd, advocating for social justice and equality. He stood tall, unwavering in his commitment to fight for the rights of the marginalized, his words a powerful testament to his unwavering belief in a better world. Thomas felt the energy of the crowd, the weight of the cause, the pastor's unwavering courage. He felt the rhythm of the march, the heat of the sun on his skin, and the weight of the cause in his heart. These weren't fleeting images, they were immersive experiences. Thomas felt the textures, smelled the aromas, heard the sounds, and tasted the flavors of each scene. He felt the cold of the hospital room, the warmth of the soup kitchen, the heat of the sun on the protest march. He felt the emotions of the people around Pastor James, their fear, their hope, their gratitude. He felt the weight of their struggles, their joys, their unwavering faith. Each dream revealed a facet of Pastor James's life, showcasing his unwavering commitment to serving his community. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a healer, a provider, an advocate. He was a man who dedicated his life to helping others, regardless of their background or beliefs. And each dream chipped away at the wall of resentment Thomas had built around his heart, revealing the hollowness of his prejudice. The dreams weren't simply showing him Pastor James's life. They were forcing him to confront his own. They were exposing the stark contrast between his own bitterness and the pastor's unwavering compassion. The weight of his actions pressed down on him harder with each dream, the guilt growing stronger, the unease intensifying. He was beginning to understand the true depth of the man he had so carelessly defiled. The dreams were not just haunting him, they were changing him. One dream stood out from the rest. It wasn't set in a bustling soup kitchen or a crowded hospital room. It was a solitary scene, a quiet moment of reflection. Thomas found himself in a small, unadorned room. The only furniture a simple wooden chair and a small, worn table. Pastor James sat in the chair, his head bowed, his hands clasped together. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination a single shaft of moonlight that pierced through a small, grimy window. The air was heavy with a sense of quiet contemplation. This wasn't a scene of active service. It was a moment of quiet introspection, a glimpse into the pastor's inner life. Thomas watched as Pastor James prayed, his words inaudible, his body trembling slightly. He wasn't praying for himself. He was praying for others, for the sick, the poor, the marginalized. He was praying for those who suffered, those who were oppressed, those who were forgotten. As Thomas watched, the scene shifted, revealing glimpses of Pastor James's life, moments of adversity and hardship. He saw the young pastor facing down a hostile mob, his voice unwavering, his faith unshaken. He saw him enduring the sting of racial slurs, the pain of discrimination, the weight of prejudice. He saw him being denied service at a local diner, being spat upon in the street, being threatened with violence. These weren't just fleeting images, they were visceral experiences. Thomas felt the sting of the slurs, the humiliation of being denied service, the fear of violence. But through it all, Pastor James's faith remained unwavering. He never wavered in his commitment to serving his community, never faltered in his belief in the power of love and compassion. He faced adversity with quiet dignity, his faith a shield against the hatred and prejudice he encountered. He never retaliated, never succumbed to bitterness or resentment. He simply continued to serve, to love, to forgive. This dream wasn't just a showcase of Pastor James's resilience. It was a testament to his profound faith. It revealed the source of his strength, the wellspring of his compassion. It wasn't simply a belief in a higher power. It was a deep-seated conviction that love conquers all, that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, faith can prevail. Thomas watched, mesmerized, as Pastor James continued his prayer, his voice rising in a crescendo of faith and hope. He saw the tears streaming down the pastor's face, not tears of despair or defeat, but tears of sorrow for the suffering of others, tears of compassion, tears of unwavering faith. The scene was deeply moving, a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit, the enduring power of faith, and the transformative capacity of love. As the dream faded, Thomas was left with a profound sense of awe and respect. He had witnessed not just the outward actions of Pastor James, but the inner strength, the unwavering faith that fueled his life of service. He had seen the man's resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship, his unwavering commitment to his beliefs, his profound capacity for compassion and forgiveness. The weight of his own actions pressed down on him with renewed intensity. He had not only defiled a grave, he had attacked a man of profound faith, a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been wrong, profoundly and irrevocably wrong. The dreams were not just revealing Pastor James's life. They were changing Thomas's. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to make amends. The dreams continued, each one a hammer blow against the wall of prejudice Thomas had built around his heart. The vivid imagery, the sensory details, the raw emotions. They were chipping away at his defenses, exposing the hollowness of his resentment, the shallowness of his justifications. He couldn't simply dismiss them as mere figments of his imagination. They felt too real, too visceral, too deeply embedded in his consciousness. He woke each morning feeling drained, exhausted, not from physical exertion, but from the emotional weight of the dreams. The anger that had fueled his act of vandalism was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a growing sense of unease, a gnawing guilt that refused to be ignored. He tried to rationalize his actions, to cling to his prejudices, but the dreams kept returning, shattering his carefully constructed defenses. He found himself replaying the dreams throughout the day, the images flashing before his eyes, the emotions flooding his senses. He saw Pastor James's gentle smile, heard his soothing voice, felt the warmth of his compassion. He felt the weight of the hunger in the soup kitchen, the fear in the hospital room, the energy of the protest march. He felt the pain of the pastor's suffering, the injustice of the discrimination he faced. The contrast between Pastor James's life and his own was stark, a jarring juxtaposition of compassion and bitterness, service and selfishness. He began to see the absurdity of his own prejudices, the shallowness of his resentment. He realized that his anger had been fueled by ignorance, by a lack of understanding, by a deep-seated fear of the other. The dreams weren't just revealing Pastor James's life. They were forcing Thomas to confront his own. They were exposing his own failings, his own shortcomings, his own deep-seated prejudices. He began to see himself through the eyes of the people Pastor James had served, the hungry, the sick, the marginalized. He saw his own actions not as acts of righteous indignation, but as acts of cruelty, acts of hatred, acts of profound disrespect. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with crushing force. He felt the weight of the broken headstone, the scattered earth, the desecrated grave. He felt the weight of the pastor's suffering, the weight of the community's grief, the weight of his own guilt. He couldn't escape it. It was a burden he had to carry. He started to question everything he believed, everything he had ever been taught. His worldview, once firmly rooted in prejudice and resentment, began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of empathy and understanding. The dreams were not simply haunting him. They were transforming him. They were stripping away the layers of ignorance and hatred, revealing the compassionate heart that had always been there, buried beneath the debris of his prejudices. He knew he couldn't continue to live with the weight of his actions, the burden of his guilt. He had to do something, anything, to make amends. The dreams had shown him the path. Now he had to follow it. The battle raged within Thomas, a war between his ingrained biases and the powerful impact of the dreams. His waking hours were filled with a turmoil he'd never known, a constant struggle between the anger that had driven him and the burgeoning empathy that the dreams had ignited. He was a man torn in two, his soul a battlefield of conflicting emotions. His days were a blur of conflicting impulses. He'd find himself drawn to the church, the very place he'd once scorned, only to pull back at the last minute, overcome by shame and self-doubt. He'd start to research Pastor James's life, only to stop, convinced that it was a futile exercise, a pointless attempt to justify his actions. He'd try to dismiss the dreams as mere hallucinations, the product of a guilty conscience, but the vividness of the images, the intensity of the emotions, wouldn't allow him to escape their grip. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, wrestling with his conscience. He'd replay the events of that night, dissecting his actions, searching for a way to rationalize his behavior, to find some justification for his cruelty. But the more he analyzed, the more he realized the depth of his wrongdoing, the profound impact of his actions. He tried to talk to people, to share his burden, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't articulate the turmoil within him, the conflict between his ingrained biases and the burgeoning empathy that the dreams had awakened. He felt isolated, alone in his struggle, a prisoner of his own guilt. He tried to distract himself, immersing himself in work, but even his routine tasks seemed meaningless, devoid of purpose. He found himself unable to concentrate, his mind constantly drifting back to the dreams, to the images of Pastor James, to the weight of his own actions. He tried to escape through alcohol, but the liquor only amplified his anxiety, turning his inner turmoil into a raging storm. The conflict was exhausting, a relentless battle that left him drained and depleted. He felt like a man caught in a riptide, pulled in two directions at once, unable to find his footing, unable to escape the undertow of his guilt. He was trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination, unable to forgive himself, unable to find peace. He knew he couldn't continue to live like this, trapped in this cycle of self-destruction. He had to make a choice, a decision that would determine the course of his life. He had to choose between the path of hatred and bitterness, the path he had been following for so long, and the path of forgiveness, reconciliation, and redemption. The dreams had shown him the way. Now he had to choose whether or not to follow it. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. The conflict within him was reaching a breaking point. He knew he couldn't continue to ignore the call of his conscience any longer. The time for action was fast approaching. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to make sense of the turmoil within him, Thomas began researching Pastor James's life. It started tentatively, a hesitant search online, a furtive glance at local newspaper archives. He felt a strange mixture of shame and curiosity, a morbid fascination with the man he had so deeply wronged. He expected to find evidence to support his prejudice, to justify his actions, to somehow lessen the weight of his guilt. Instead, he discovered a life far richer, far more complex, far more profound than he could have ever imagined. He started with the church website, expecting a sanitized biography, a collection of carefully chosen anecdotes designed to portray the pastor in a positive light. What he found, however, was far more compelling. The website was a testament to the pastor's life of service, a collection of stories and testimonials from members of the community, each one a testament to the pastor's unwavering compassion and dedication. He read stories of the pastor's tireless work with the homeless, his unwavering advocacy for social justice, his tireless efforts to bridge the divides within the community. He delved deeper, searching local archives, poring over old newspaper clippings, reading articles and obituaries. He discovered a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, a man who had faced adversity with quiet dignity, a man whose faith had never wavered, even in the face of overwhelming hardship. He learned about the pastor's work with the underprivileged, his efforts to improve the lives of the marginalized, his tireless advocacy for those who had no voice. He learned about the pastor's unwavering commitment to building bridges, to fostering understanding, to promoting unity within the community. He read stories of the pastor's interventions during times of crisis, his calming presence during moments of conflict, his unwavering support for those in need. He read about the pastor's tireless efforts to improve the lives of the community, his work with local schools, his involvement in community development projects, his unwavering commitment to social justice. He learned about the pastor's deep faith, his unwavering belief in the power of love and compassion, his profound understanding of the human spirit. The more he learned, the more profound his sense of guilt became. He realized the extent of his ignorance, the shallowness of his prejudice, the cruelty of his actions. He had judged a man based on superficial assumptions, based on his own ingrained biases, based on a lack of understanding. He had defiled the grave of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, a man who had embodied the very values he had so vehemently rejected. The weight of his guilt intensified, but it was now accompanied by a growing sense of shame and remorse. He had not only wronged Pastor James, he had wronged the entire community, the people the pastor had served so tirelessly. He had betrayed the very values he claimed to uphold. He had acted out of ignorance and prejudice, and now he had to confront the consequences of his actions. He had to find a way to make amends, to repair the damage he had done. The research wasn't just revealing Pastor James's life. It was revealing the depth of Thomas's own failings. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to do something to atone for his sins. Driven by a mixture of guilt and a desperate need for understanding, Thomas ventured into the heart of the community he had so casually dismissed. He started by visiting the church, a place he had previously avoided, a place that now felt both intimidating and strangely welcoming. He sat in the back pew during a Sunday service, observing the congregation, listening to the hymns, feeling the palpable sense of community. The atmosphere was one of quiet reverence, a shared sense of loss, but also a deep-seated pride in the legacy Pastor James had left behind. After the service, he tentatively approached some of the parishioners, introducing himself and explaining, in halting, apologetic terms, his reason for being there. He expected hostility, anger, perhaps even violence. Instead, he was met with a surprising mixture of compassion and understanding. People shared their stories of Pastor James, their memories of his kindness, his generosity, his unwavering faith. They spoke of his tireless work with the homeless, his advocacy for social justice, his unwavering commitment to building bridges within the community. He listened to stories of the pastor's interventions during times of crisis, his calming presence during moments of conflict, his unwavering support for those in need. He heard tales of the pastor's tireless efforts to improve the lives of the community, his work with local schools, his involvement in community development projects, his unwavering commitment to social justice. He learned about the pastor's deep faith, his unwavering belief in the power of love and compassion, his profound understanding of the human spirit. Each story was a testament to the pastor's profound impact on the community, a stark contrast to Thomas's own shallow judgments and hateful actions. He heard about the pastor's work with the underprivileged, his efforts to improve the lives of the marginalized, his tireless advocacy for those who had no voice. He learned about the pastor's unwavering commitment to building bridges, to fostering understanding, to promoting unity within the community. The outpouring of grief and respect for Pastor James was overwhelming, a powerful testament to the man's profound influence. Thomas felt the weight of his own wrongdoings, the depth of his ignorance, the cruelty of his actions. He had not only defiled a grave, he had attacked the heart of the community, the very fabric of the town. He had undermined the legacy of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, a man who had embodied the very values he had so vehemently rejected. He realized that his act of vandalism hadn't been a simple act of destruction. It had been an attack on the community's collective memory, an assault on their shared sense of identity. He had tried to erase a legacy of compassion and service, a legacy that was deeply woven into the fabric of the community. The community's response was not just a condemnation of his actions. It was a reaffirmation of Pastor James's legacy, a powerful testament to the enduring power of faith, love, and compassion. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. He knew he had to do something, anything, to make amends. He had to find a way to atone for his actions, to repair the damage he had done. The community's response was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the profound impact of his actions and the urgent need for redemption. The weight of his actions pressed down on Thomas with crushing force. The dreams, the research, the community's response, it all converged, creating an unbearable burden of guilt and remorse. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't undo it. He had to do something, anything, to atone for his sins. The decision wasn't easy. It was a struggle, a battle waged within the confines of his own mind. He wrestled with doubt, with fear, with self-loathing. He questioned his ability to make amends, his capacity for change. He wondered if it was even possible to repair the damage he had done, to undo the harm he had caused. He considered simply disappearing, escaping the weight of his guilt, running away from the consequences of his actions. But the dreams kept returning, the images of Pastor James's life flashing before his eyes, the weight of his compassion pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore the call of his conscience any longer. He had to face his actions, confront his guilt, and find a way to make amends. The decision crystallized in a moment of quiet clarity, a sudden understanding that went beyond simple remorse. It was a profound realization that his actions had not only harmed Pastor James, but had also betrayed his own values, his own sense of decency. The decision to restore the desecrated grave wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a culmination of weeks of internal struggle, a culmination of dreams, research, and profound self-reflection. It wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It was about seeking redemption, about finding a way to atone for his actions, to repair the damage he had done. It was about acknowledging the depth of his wrongdoing and taking responsibility for his actions. He knew it wouldn't be easy. It would require physical labor, emotional fortitude, and a willingness to confront the shame and humiliation of his actions. He would have to face the community, to acknowledge his wrongdoing, to ask for forgiveness. He would have to confront his own prejudices, his own ingrained biases, and find a way to move beyond them. He would have to confront the darkness within himself and find the light. But he was ready. He had spent weeks wrestling with his conscience, and now he was ready to face the consequences of his actions. He was ready to make amends. He was ready to begin the long process of healing, both for himself and for the community he had wronged. The decision was made. The path was clear. He would restore the grave, not as an act of appeasement, but as an act of genuine repentance, a testament to his commitment to change, a symbol of his journey toward redemption. The weight of his decision was heavy, but it was also liberating. He was finally free to begin the difficult but necessary work of making amends. The task was arduous, physically demanding, emotionally draining. Thomas spent days at the cemetery, working tirelessly to restore the desecrated grave. He started by clearing away the weeds and debris, his hands blistered and aching, his back stiff and sore. He carefully gathered the scattered earth, replacing it gently, smoothing the soil with his calloused hands. He found a local stonemason, explaining his situation with quiet humility, and commissioned a new headstone, a simple, unadorned stone that bore Pastor James's name and dates with understated dignity. As he worked, his mind wandered, reflecting on the events that had led him to this point. He replayed the dreams, the research, the community's response, each detail etched into his memory. He thought about his own prejudices, his own ingrained biases, the ignorance that had fueled his hatred. He thought about Pastor James's life, his unwavering faith, his tireless service, his profound compassion. The contrast between their two lives was stark, a jarring juxtaposition of bitterness and compassion, selfishness and selflessness. He saw the absurdity of his own prejudices, the shallowness of his resentment, the cruelty of his actions. He had judged a man based on superficial assumptions, based on his own ingrained biases, based on a lack of understanding. He had defiled the grave of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, a man who had embodied the very values he had so vehemently rejected. The physical act of restoration became a metaphor for his own inner transformation. As he painstakingly repaired the grave, he was also repairing the damage he had done to his own soul. The work was slow, meticulous, demanding both physical and emotional strength. He worked in silence, lost in his thoughts, his hands moving with a deliberate purpose. He found himself thinking about the people Pastor James had served, the lives he had touched, the difference he had made in the community. He thought about the pastor's unwavering faith, his unwavering commitment to his beliefs, his profound capacity for compassion and forgiveness. He thought about the community's response, their compassion, their understanding, their willingness to forgive. As the days turned into weeks, the grave slowly began to take shape. The scattered earth was replaced, the weeds were cleared, the new headstone stood tall and proud. The site, once a symbol of hatred and destruction, was now a testament to repentance and restoration. The physical act of restoration was a mirror to his own inner transformation. He was slowly but surely piecing together the fragments of his shattered soul, rebuilding his life, one stone, one prayer, one act of service at a time. The restoration of the grave was not just a physical act. It was a spiritual journey, a testament to the power of repentance and the possibility of redemption. The work was almost complete, and with it, a sense of peace began to settle over him. The final stone was set in place. Thomas stood back, surveying his work. The grave was restored, the headstone gleaming in the afternoon sun, a simple yet dignified marker of a life well lived. He hadn't just repaired the physical damage. He had also repaired a part of himself, a part that had been broken by hatred and ignorance. The act of restoration had been a journey of self-discovery, a process of healing and transformation. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet serenity that had been absent from his life for so long. The weight of his guilt had lessened, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance and understanding. He had faced his actions, confronted his prejudices, and taken responsibility for his wrongdoing. He had sought redemption, not through absolution, but through atonement. He returned to the church, this time not with trepidation, but with a sense of quiet resolve. He spoke to the congregation, not seeking forgiveness, but offering an explanation, a confession, a testament to his transformation. He shared his story, his dreams, his research, his journey of repentance. He spoke of his prejudices, his ignorance, his hatred. He spoke of the profound impact Pastor James's life had had on him, the transformative power of the dreams, the community's unexpected compassion. The congregation listened with quiet attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise, understanding, and forgiveness. There was no anger, no condemnation, only acceptance and compassion. They understood his journey, his struggle, his repentance. They saw in him not a villain, but a man struggling with his conscience, a man seeking redemption. The community's response was not just a gesture of forgiveness. It was a testament to the power of empathy, the transformative capacity of compassion, the enduring strength of the human spirit. They had accepted his apology, not because he deserved it, but because they understood the transformative power of repentance. They saw in him the potential for change, the possibility of redemption. Thomas found a measure of peace, not in forgetting his past, but in accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward. He continued to attend church, becoming an active member of the community, dedicating his time and energy to serving others. He found a new purpose in his life, a new sense of meaning, a new understanding of the power of forgiveness and the importance of compassion. The story of Pastor James's life and Thomas's journey became a testament to the enduring power of faith, the transformative capacity of love, and the possibility of redemption. It was a story of forgiveness, not just for Thomas, but for the community, a story that highlighted the importance of understanding, empathy, and the enduring impact of a life well lived. It was a story that affirmed the power of human connection, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring possibility of hope. The restoration of the grave was a symbol of Thomas's transformation, a testament to the power of repentance, and a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal.